Well, I'm going to give you a flyover of where we're going to go with the next two topics. So in Marital Abuse 1, I'd like to address the subject from the standpoint of a marriage counselor and the process of how abuse comes to, at least to my awareness, at least as it has historically, and then a definition of abuse and some about kinds of abuse, which I think Brian did a good job in describing the kinds of abuse, and then taking steps to address it. And in the second topic, I'd like to address the subject of abuse in marriage from the standpoint of the church. Now, when I say from the standpoint of the church, I think of it not as me being the church, but as one voice thinking about maybe how a church should appropriately abuse in marriage. And that is broken into two parts. The one is preventative measures, like things to do to prevent abuse, and the other is redemptive measures that a church can take in attempts to try to redeem the abuser. So that's kind of where we're going in the two topics. So just a few comments from the previous topics. I was thinking of Mark's topic about marriage God's way, how Scripture says marriage, in many ways, how we understand marriage should be. And to think about some of the things, some of the principles that Mark presented and taught, I'd like to suggest, though, if you take those principles and try to apply them to an abusive marriage, it's not going to be effective for various reasons. Here are some of them. It's ineffective because it answers a matter before thoroughly hearing it. And by the end of this topic and the next one, you'll maybe have maybe a more understanding of what I mean by thoroughly hearing it. Another thing I thought about and why applying the principles that Mark talked about, trying to apply them to an abusive marriage is, and because they're ineffective because it applies a Band-Aid where the jugular is severed. Now, that's pretty strong. And thirdly, I would say it's ineffective because in many ways it's trying to do, here's the way Jesus said it. I think it's straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. So I think it's the idea of we kind of focus on the wrong thing. We kind of focus on what is the victim doing or not doing that is bringing this abuse on. And I'm thinking, in my mind, that's seriously misguided. And that's a way of saying you strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. So this is kind of where we're going in this topic. So after listening to Brian's topic, marital abuse and symptoms, you might be tempted to think, I know what abuse looks like, so I'm going to call it out when I see it. Chris Moles, one of the authors that he mentioned, tells a story of how he illustrates or came to understand abuse. He says he grew up in West Virginia, and in West Virginia there's lots of mountains, and you can't see real far. And so whenever he'd see a train, he'd see a piece of a train. He might see the engine, maybe two engines, a car, maybe the last one, what was that, a caboose, if you want to call it that. But Chris never saw the whole train. One time he drove out to Indiana, and he was out in just where it was wide open, and he saw this long train, and he wondered, what in the world is that? Well, here it was a train. He just grew up with a train. He thought a train was these pieces that he saw. But when he actually saw it, it was like, now I understand what a train is. Okay, so when you think about abuse, think of it that way. Usually when abuse comes to you, you don't see the whole train. Okay, maybe you do. I have yet to interact with anyone that actually said, I am being abused. There's exceptions, but usually they had interacted with someone else before they interacted with me. So in my illustration, so that's a good illustration about abuse. Okay, here's one that kind of resonates with me and kind of what my experience is. So on the windowsill of my office, I have a 12-piece wooden puzzle that represents a pickup truck that can be disassembled, and assembled in a matter of minutes. If you have experience or with practice. So here's what this puzzle looks like. Disassembled. This illustrates what people that have experienced abuse usually present. And it can be presented in a couple different ways. The one is, sometimes the individual will describe one piece of the puzzle of abuse. To them, the piece does not yet have a name. Okay, so they come and they're describing one piece of something. And when you try to make sense of one piece, it's kind of hard to do that. So don't think of abuse coming to you in a package. It usually doesn't come that way. The other way it can be presented is sometimes the individual will describe many pieces of a puzzle, the puzzle of abuse. To them, the pieces are just pieces, isolated and disconnected one from the other. So what Brian presented to you is kind of the pieces put together. So you have to make a distinction. Abuse doesn't always just, you see it and you're able to say, yep, that's it. No. Abuse has many pieces, and you have to be able to put those pieces together. So, like I said, this is my experience. I don't have a whole lot of experience. Well, let me give you an idea of experience, okay? So, we interact with couples. I interact with couples. There's about we have a 3-week cycle that we do. So, for 2 weeks, we have a couple, one couple each week. Then the third week, we don't have anybody. So if you take that over a year, that's about 17 couples a year. So let's put that to 15, just with schedule. So it might come to an average of 15 couples that I interact with per year. Okay? So out of those 15 couples, I thought, I want to see, I had read a statistic in a few different places that said in a Christian setting or professing Christians, the prevalence of abuse is about 25%. A little bit higher than what Brian said, but it's in the same ballpark. Okay, 25%. And so I thought, At first I said, I don't believe that. And I thought a little bit to myself, and I don't believe it. And I thought, I'm in a church. I'm part of a church. So one way where to test that, if you're comfortable doing that, is do it in your church. So at the time where I was going to church, I thought, I'll test it here. And I thought about it, and I kind of went through my mind, people in our church, And I was like, I can't believe this. I thought I'd test it another way. So I went over the last 4 or 5 years of people that I've interacted with. And I put their names on a piece of paper, and then I went through them and evaluated, was there patterns of abuse? Let me see, that's 5 years. Let's say 5 years. What did I say? 15 per year. 15, 30, 45, 60, 75. Well, I went through and I was kind of shocked how many I could put a mark and say there was a pattern of abuse here. So I tend to agree with what Brian said. Marital abuse is on the rise. I don't know why. Maybe it's just, for me personally, I'm kind of slow to catch on to things. But I agree with him. Maybe it's just coming to our attention, but I'm saying it's pretty prevalent. So be alert. This is the assembled truck. Now, when you go back, does this look like a truck? No. So when you see abuse, you might see one piece, you might see a bunch of pieces. It's not all constructed for you, not by the people that come to you, mostly, at least in my experience, that's how it's been. Now, suppose an individual knows that the pieces form a truck, and I do that sometimes, depending on what I'm interacting with a couple about. I'll take the truck, the assembled truck, put it in front of them, and then I'll disassemble it. And then I'll ask them, would you want to try and put it back together? It's interesting to observe people. Some people will take the initiative and start to put it together. They'll actually work together to try to put it back together. Some, though, are reluctant to initiate anything. And for those people that are reluctant, they have my attention. I want to know, like, what's going on? Like, why don't you initiate? What's going on inside you? Why don't you try to do this? It's not uncommon to hear this. I've tried that. It doesn't work. If a person, you ask them, can you describe what you're facing? They struggle to come up with words. They have trouble finding vocabulary to describe what they're experiencing. Sometimes they don't want to say in a certain context. So if people lack initiative, okay, you might be looking at someone that's in an abusive relationship. So abuse in marriage poisons, undermines, or even destroys a person's initiative. So if a person is reluctant to speak, hesitant to give his or her perspective, or frequently says, I've tried that doesn't work, you may be looking at someone who has common effects of abuse. Because domestic oppression is such a complex and sometimes dangerous issue, it takes courage and it takes wisdom how to address it. So on the subject of marital abuse, we'll begin with just defining a little bit what is domestic abuse, or defining it. So I think Brian did a good job describing what it is, different kinds of abuse. I'll just give a short definition. So abuse is this. Defining abuse is a way of saying this speech or behavior has crossed the moral line. This violates the standard of how to treat another human person particularly in the context of marriage. So abuse refers to a singular act or a pattern, or sometimes you hear the word cycle, of speech or behavior that violates biblical standards for interpersonal relationships. So, for example, rape or physical abuse, those can be one occasion, they can happen one time. Okay? That's a violation. That's physical or sexual abuse. It doesn't have to be a pattern. Just one time is adequate to fit the definition. When done repeatedly, they become a pattern or cycle of abuse. So let's make a distinction here. All married people sin in various ways. I do, my wife does, toward each other. Okay? But when we talk about marital abuse, we're talking about a pattern, usually a pattern or a cycle of abuse. That's what fits the category of, it can either be speech or behavior. Usually it falls into those two. Now you can have psychological, mental, emotional, you can sort it out in different ways, but these two for sure, it falls under these two categories. You violate in speech or behavior. So here's just a short definition. So physical, some of the same things that Brian said, hitting, pushing, punching, beating, and pulling hair would be examples. It's also not giving a spouse space when he or she requests it. And I would tend to agree with Brian, it tends to be mostly males abusing females. It can be the other way. From my years of experience, I've seen it maybe 3 or 4 ladies that have been that way, that have been abusive. So it can also be, the physical can be touching them sexually in spite of requests to not do so. So an abuser will think along the lines of, this is my body, I can do with it what I want. That's a form of abuse. I remember a few years ago, a couple came to Deeper Life. I was not interacting with them, someone else was. And during a Bible study, we met together as a group and had Bible study. And the gentleman in that case that came for counseling was in a wheelchair. And during the Bible study, we had a discussion, and he made a comment, and one of our staff members noticed they were sitting at the crack in the table, and they noticed that when he made his comment, he got a kick. He had, in her mind, he had been out of line. And so he didn't say anything after that in the Bible study. Kinds of abuse, it can be sexual. Sexual abuse can be different forms: unwanted, forced, or coerced sexual acts. Sex or sexual acts not freely or willingly consented to. Sometimes wives describe their husbands forcing themselves on them even after they verbalize their no. And it's appropriate for a wife to be able to say no. It's appropriate to do that. There are times when it's inappropriate to have sexual relations. And if a wife desires not to, then she should be able to communicate that. She has the biblical right to do so. Sometimes a spouse, usually a wife, that I've heard, will wake up from sleep and no consent, and this is forced on her. Okay, that would be a kind of sexual abuse. Verbal abuse, name calling, yelling, screaming, lecturing, cursing, and reviling are examples. This is a significant type of abuse in marriage. In many other relationships as well, but particularly or specifically in marriage. There's the economic. Usually that means financially, somehow. Financially, withholding, controlling, hindering, or manipulating finances or economic opportunities. So if a wife wants a job Having considered all things, this is an opportunity. Okay, not necessarily when she has children at home or has other responsibilities. We're saying when she's free to do so, when it's maybe wise to do so, where a husband will get in the way of that. He may do it in different ways, like hindering from her actually doing it or undermining when she has a job. Economic can also be of not providing a vehicle. I remember one lady describing her relationship with her husband as he would have a vehicle and he would take it for the day and she could not leave. She was isolated in different ways, but this was one way, is not providing a vehicle, not making sure she didn't have a vehicle so she could go about the day. If she needed to go, that was beside the point. Spiritual abuse, or also referred to as role or authority abuse. So this is assuming a role or going beyond one's role or misusing position in service of self, like self-serving. The part of assuming a role is stepping into a role that is not his or hers to assume. Going beyond one's role is stepping beyond or outside the bounds of role, demanding or forcing someone to conform. Like sometimes husbands think it is their responsibility to make their wives do certain things. Like, for example, the idea of submission. Sometimes husbands, will think it is their responsibility to make their wives submit. That's misguided and sinful. Misusing position in service of self. In New Testament terminology, this would be called lording it over someone. And lording it over someone violates kingdom of heaven principles of operation and function. Jesus said, it shall not be so among you. Not in the church, not in the home, because the home is kind of under the umbrella of the kingdom. Like, if people are believers, okay, they're part of the kingdom. If a church is part of the kingdom of heaven, lording that's out. It's not acceptable. So spiritual abuse most often connotes or is associated with, is inseparable from authority. A person in any role or position over others can use that power in good or bad ways. Spiritual abuse is using that power inappropriately. It's a misuse or abuse of power. So a church leader can misuse his power over church members. A husband can use his power over his wife or his children inappropriately. A wife can do so, the same thing, over her children. It's usually not the other way around. Usually the one over misuses it over those under them. So in a marriage, it's a husband using it over his wife. I think it's a little hard for some husbands to understand this concept, that by virtue of being a husband, the husband has certain power or authority that both he and she recognizes. Sometimes a husband just does not get it. He cannot put himself in his wife's shoes to understand what she is describing. It's almost like she is without power, like she is less than him. And that can be that she doesn't understand it, but sometimes it's because he has misused it. He has misused the position. He has used the position for serving himself, not for serving someone else. Okay, that's a misuse of power. Many husbands have a hard time grasping that. Kinds of abuse. And this one is a little bit, I'm not sure where I come out on it yet, but it's this idea, what about emotional or mental abuse or psychological? Okay, so there seems to be something to it, but in my understanding, it comes more in the area of either verbal or physical. They're either doing something verbally or physically, or in combination, and this is the result. So, individuals in the context of abuse often experience a host of unpleasant thoughts and feelings, which is appropriate. People should, when people are in an abusive context, they should feel things. If they're not feeling things, there is something wrong with them. If they feel things, there's something right. And if they have mental processes going on, even if they're unpleasant, they are functioning normally. That is a good thing. It's when people are not thinking, when people are not feeling something, okay, that's problematic. So, in an abusive context, people generally feel and think things. That's appropriate. Since mind and emotion are involved and overlap with the categories mentioned, like in abuse, they affect the mind and the emotion of the individual who is in the abusive context. But this seems more a result of being violated in these other ways than being mentally and emotionally abused. Another way of saying this is the kinds of abuse I mentioned above result in the victim having their thoughts and emotions being affected, but stopping short of calling it mental or emotional abuse. At least that's how I would understand it at this point. So, one reason for the reservation about calling it mental or emotional abuse is addressing issues with some people can feel like mental or emotional abuse, even if you do it in a proper manner. So, an individual convinced that sexual perverted practices are inappropriate can feel to them like mental or emotional abuse. Now, I realize the manner has a lot to do with how you do it, but I would say, I don't know if I would call that mental or emotional abuse. But we're talking about in the context. So if you use it in the term mental emotional abuse, it's okay to use it, just make sure you know what you're talking about and how you're going to help somebody in the process. So these are different kinds of abuse. So symptoms of abuse. In this context, what I like to talk about is just, when I say symptoms, I mean some of the effects. Okay, so when people experience things, they have symptoms, things that show up for them. So in this context, first, let me start with perpetrator. When I use the word perpetrator, I simply mean this is the term that I use for the person that abuses, like that does the abuse to the other person. So an abuser, often big things going on are control and manipulation. Those are just, they're pretty basic. By control, I mean to use power over another inappropriately or sinfully. So the misuse of authority is an abuse of power. A victim is simply the person that's being abused, that's on the receiving end of abuse. Now, with each of these, when I say perpetrator, I do not mean the person is less than a person. He remains a person. If it's a woman, she remains a person. Like, we don't define them as, at their core, they are an abuser. That's the biggest thing about them. No, I don't think so. I don't think that way. The victim, the same way. A victim is someone that's on the receiving end of abuse, but the person is still responsible for what they do or how they act. Now, I realize it can affect how they act, but they still remain a person. Like, they can still make choices. They maybe don't make the wisest choices, but they still remain a person created in the image of God. So just clarifying some terms. So a perpetrator tends to operate by control and manipulation. So here are the things that you tend to see. So manipulation, in my understanding, would be kind of to illustrate it, is I call it emotional arm twisting. That is, taking a person's arm and emotionally twisting it with words or their behavior, and twisting it and putting it up behind their back until they give in to what they want them to do. So manipulation, the definition that Webster's modified, is to play upon by artful, unfair, or deceitful means for personal advantage. Control and manipulation are often found working together. Where you find one, you'll find the other. It's almost like twin sisters or twin brothers. Where one is, the other is. Another big concept in a big symptom that you see in abusers is the sense of entitlement. Entitlement is a sense that I have certain privileges, am owed something, or that a person has a particular right that apply only to themselves. Okay, that's the sense of entitlement. I think Brian referred to it as male privilege. And it's male privilege because it's often males use it. Not all males, but often you see it with males doing it. And then this is pretty common, is anger. And anger can be kind of two different forms, particularly, or a mix of the two. It's unpredictable. So the one is, basically anger is this: it's a reaction to a perceived sense of wrong, usually against oneself. It's a perceived sense that you've done me wrong and I have a right to be angry, or I'm angry because of it. So in a sense, you caused it. If you wouldn't have done it, then I wouldn't be angry. Okay, the two forms of anger are, the one is the hot anger and the other is the cold anger. So the hot anger is, it's loud and bright and it's hot. It burns you, it scorches you. Usually with words, sometimes with action, like destructive things. The other side is the cold anger. Cold anger is along the lines of, I don't react. I get even. Like it's cold, it's looking into somebody's eyes and you see ice. I don't react, but it's deadly. They can keep their tone, but it's painful. They won't yell, but they'll be silent. You understand what cold silence is? There's an elephant in the room, but you walk around it. You talk to me, I will not give you the time of day. It's not what did you say, it's it sends a message. You do not treat me like that. That's a form of anger. Again, the victim is a term for the person that's violated. So here are some symptoms, pretty common symptoms. These two kind of go together, fear or anxiety. So fear is an innate sense of and response to danger. We tend to, generally, as Anabaptist people, we kind of shied away from that. Okay? Fear in many ways is appropriate and right. It's an innate sense of and response to danger. When you're in danger, you should act. You should do something to get out of danger. I think in some ways we've kind of toned that down, that if you're afraid, you must have some kind of sin. And I'm saying that can be dangerous to teach that. On the other side of fear is anxiety, is fear on steroids. That just means sometimes when a person is anxious, is because they've had a lot of experience of fear, and they should be afraid. like they should be anxious. To not be anxious is, I'm saying, something is wrong with them, because they are in a dangerous situation and they should be anxious. So living with an abuser, being around him or her, is often dangerous and triggers anxiety. Many victims fear telling anyone because they believe no one will believe them. And that's often why they're silent. For one, they themselves don't know what's going on. They understand pieces, they understand some of the things that they're experiencing, but they would, even if they put it together, they'd be afraid to tell anyone. Because in many cases, they've been put under the bus. You understand the term? Like, if you speak up, you're the target. It's not, tell me more, help me understand this. It's, no, this cannot be. You need to be silenced. Besides fear and anxiety is confusion. And this is that puzzle piece, like the pieces piled together on one pile. Confusion is the result of blending distinct thoughts and emotions and making them indistinct. It's like taking a whole piece and putting it in a blender and turning the blender on. Okay, then you have confusion. Okay, you have a blending of ideas and no longer be able to distinguish between this and this. I feel this, this. No, it's all blended together. It's the inability to distinguish between me and you. That's what happens in abuse. It's almost like we are one, and I cause you to abuse me. That is faulty. And sometimes that's actually indoctrination. Abusers have the power to do that. Like, you made me do that. If you would not have, then I wouldn't have. And people that are abused like that, they cannot distinguish between that. After a while, they actually believe that, which results in internal disorder and disorganization. So that's the idea of being confused. So when you interact with a person that's really confused, you want to. That's one of the symptoms. Okay, so just because someone is confused does not mean they're in an abusive context. But if you see that, I'm saying do not dismiss that they're in an abusive context. Here's another symptom: silence or reaction. Victims of abuse are often silenced by fear, intimidation, confusion, and or threat. Many victims go silent out of fear. It will only get worse. And often it does. If they speak up, it gets worse. They know how to cope with abuse, but they don't know what it will be like if they expose it. That's a whole new and scary world, so they don't say anything. Some victims, in contrast to going silent, react like they will not be silenced. I remember interacting with a couple, and the man tended to be kind of use his privilege as a husband to make decisions without consulting his wife or talking about the matter. It was, I thought about it and I decided, and I'm just communicating it to you. Well, she was not a lady that would just sit back. I remember her using fairly colorful words that I would not use, but she did, and that was a reaction. Now, I could have said, what is going on? Why are you? But I saw it play out in front of me, and so, yeah, I could see where she was coming from. Am I saying it's appropriate? No. But I'm saying this is a problem here, what he's doing as well. So some ladies are silenced. Others, I mean, they come off the chair. I remember interacting with a couple as well, and this man could be fairly level, like in tone, it would kind of range, the range would change a little bit in his tone of voice, how he would talk, but he was fairly level. His wife would be, I mean, she would have serious reactions. And interacting more and listening and trying to understand what's going on here. Well, behind the scenes, they had had marriage problems, and a relative was counseling them, and the relative was counseling him to give her corporal punishment, and he did. Did it justify her reaction? I don't know if it would justify. I would say, though, I think it was appropriate. For a husband to corporally punish his wife, discipline her, something is seriously wrong. And in some ways, I think she should react. And I think I observed the reaction. So, steps in addressing abuse. This is not the only way. I'm saying this is kind of how I tend to approach it when I interact with a couple. Now remember the context. Usually people do not come to my office and say, I'm being abused, I need help. The victim doesn't say it, a perpetrator doesn't say it either. I have yet to have it happen. Now I said the exception is if they've been somewhere else and they've heard that and they've put it together, somebody put it together for them, and they may be able to describe and say, this is an abusive marriage. But just if they've never interacted with anyone about it, they come with pieces. So this is the process. So what is the purpose of addressing abuse in marriage? One, abuse is evil. Therefore, it must stop. Stopping abuse, at the very least, is what needs to happen. Now, there's a lot more that needs to happen, but for sure the abuse must stop. So, people in abusive marriage often do not realize that they would not be able to call it what it is. So this list is a series of steps to end abuse in all its forms. It moves from more interaction between the counselor and the couple to less interaction between them, away from marriage counseling and toward personal counseling. When you have abuse in marriage, this couple does not need marriage counseling. The marriage does not have a problem. This is a personal problem that is affecting the marriage. So from less interaction with the couple from more interaction with the couple to less of this, to more interaction with them as individuals. A key principle is this: the safety of the victim is a priority in this process. Let me say it again. The safety of the victim is a priority in this process. Now keep in mind, often I don't know what's going on when I interact with them together. So often there has to be separate interaction to actually get down to what is going on that is not being talked about in the actual marriage counseling. So this process is one way of uncovering abuse. However, depending on the kinds of violation that I become aware of, it is appropriate to go from step 1 to step 5 or 6 without doing 2 to 4. So that'll make sense after we go through here. So let's go into it. First, in marriage counseling, I established some priorities. Now, establishing and communicating a standard for acceptable and unacceptable speech or behavior in my presence, okay, I do that after I observe they're violating. One or the other or both are violating. So once that happens, then I establish, here are some guidelines for our interactions. So things like no interruption, shouting, swearing, name calling, slamming tables, threats, whatever things I've observed, okay, I try to lay out, okay, I understand you are frustrated, angry, whatever, but these things do not help in this context. So I would ask that you try to honor these guidelines. Now, obviously, these things have to happen before I actually establish the guideline, and so I do. I give people some space to be able to express themselves, but after a while it comes down to, okay, this is getting in the way of us being able to interact with each other, or you being able to interact with each other. So I establish guidelines, and here are some of the guidelines. They can violate the guidelines, okay, there's space for that. But if they violate them too often, okay, now we're moving toward, okay, if you're not able to control yourself, one or the other of you, then we are going to separate. This is not a threat. This is simply a matter of procedure. So one of the things I try to remember to do is when I sit down to first interact with a couple, I try to lay out for them, here's kind of the plan. We're going to meet together. We're going to talk together. If in this process of interacting for this week, if you would like to meet separately, you can communicate that to me. I've also learned that if I would like to meet separately, I can initiate that as well. I found that to be a safety for them and for myself. That it's not just that it's up to them or one of them. Sometimes one of them would like to, but they're not going to say it because there'll be some choice words in private. And so if I send some of that, then I'll initiate. We'll meet separately. So those are some of the guidelines. So establishing a standard for speech and behavior, at least in my presence. If that's violated, then it goes to this. I would advise you not to interact on certain subjects by yourselves. So when you interact with someone, third-party involvement when discussing controversial subjects. If one party tends to control, dominate, or manipulate the conversation between them as a couple, I advise them to have a third party, I call it a mediator, present when discussing controversial subjects. An abuser may be less likely to abuse when a third party is present, but that is no guarantee. I have experienced it. In being the mediator and saying, okay, we're going to talk about controversial subjects only here. Do not talk about them by yourselves. They'll violate that. Abusers will tend to violate that. Some will. When it's brought back and it's addressed, guess who's going to get it? Often, it'll be the counselor and the person that brought it to the counselor's attention. So, doing this does not guarantee anything. It just heightens and brings to the forefront the issue of abuse in marriage. And so, a counselor needs to have the gumption, the guts, the courage to address it, to call it out for what it is. But you have to establish it first. You cannot just go on a whim of, I feel like this is mental abuse, or I feel like this is marital abuse. No, you have to establish it first. And you may need to meet separately to actually establish it. Now, there's wisdom in hearing both sides. But keep in mind, sometimes hearing both sides at the same time is too dangerous. And sometimes it's actually wrong. Some things you need to report before you actually talk. It's required. So, some things are mandatory reporting. When children are involved, when it's abuse, especially when it's sexual abuse, and physical abuse. In many states, most states, you're required to report it. So this is not a time to sort out, for you or me to sort out, hey, what happened here? Some of those things need to be reported. And you can either advise the people to do it. You have a certain time to do it, time frame to do it. If you don't, I will. So those are some things that have to be laid down. So this is the process. So first, guidelines. When the guidelines are violated, then we meet separately. The guidelines are violated. Do not talk about certain subjects by yourself. When you violate that, okay, no more counseling together. From here on, it's separate counseling. I'll meet with you. We're not going to meet together. You are not in the state of mind or in the condition to be able to meet together. And this is not to threaten. This is not to try to separate a marriage. This is just saying, this is just bringing to light what is. This is reality. And sometimes that's hard to face. For a counselor, it can feel like you are making this a problem. Well, another way to think about it is, no, you are simply bringing to light what already is. This is not a game. This is reality. So, if a third party is no longer effective, individual counseling might be. You understand what I'm saying? It might be. There are no guarantees. Remember the story of Cain? At the end, he walked out. Pharaoh, let my people go. No, 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 no. Finally, they went. They weren't gone long, and he was after them. You understand what happened in the end? There's many stories in the Bible about abusers, oppressors, that do not change. Some advantages of counseling an individual, and that can be a victim or a perpetrator. Again, no guarantees. There's a tendency to greater transparency. When you don't have your spouse sitting there, you tend to open up more. There's that possibility. Person tends to be less guarded what they say. Tend to be emotionally more vulnerable. Tend to be more reflective, thoughtful, less defensive, or reactive to questions. That's no guarantee. They might be more reactive. There tends to be a diminished hostility. They tend to be more open to input. They might ask thought-provoking questions, like things that they think about and wonder. They might make a confession without the spouse present. They might acknowledge what they call faults. Okay, this is all a start of going the right direction. If you decide to meet separately, communicate to the couple why you're doing it and what your objectives are. Okay? This is not about bashing your husband or your wife. This is for me to understand what is happening. I cannot understand this when you are at each other. So I need some time alone to try to understand, to get your perspective. I'd like to get your spouse's perspective too. Sometimes that goes over, sometimes it does not. This is about having a conversation that is conducive to getting accurate and complete information to be able to help effectively. If you don't have good information, it'll impact your effectiveness. Church discipline. In cases of marital abuse where a church is involved, I inform the church leaders what is happening. Sometimes leaders are aware that couples come to deeper life. Other times leaders don't know. The couple does not want them to know for various reasons. So if this is happening in a church, I try to reach out to the leaders. If the leaders are aware, I try to reach out to them and let them know what's going on. But I try to do that with consent from the couple that's there. Sometimes they're open to it. Sometimes it's like, I don't want you to do that, for various reasons. Church discipline is another step that can be brought to bear on the abuser, not as a threat, but to warn him to turn from abuse. Actually, to do this is to curb, to get a person to turn, to help them see what they're doing is sinful and wrong. And it's a redemptive measure. I realize it's been used as a threat. I realize some of those things, those are not helpful. But I'm saying in this context, it can be used appropriately. Will it be effective? There's no guarantees. Again, exposure is bringing hidden things to light, is a significant deterrent to abuse. Not a guarantee, but a deterrent. Many people would not start abusing if they would know the consequences are going to be severe. That's understood in all areas of life. If you have a strong consequence for doing what's wrong, it tends to deter a person from doing it. But if a person is set on doing it, it doesn't matter what it is, they will do it. So, church discipline can be a deterrent. And it can help bring exposure to what a person is doing. So exposure doesn't change anyone. Exposing it doesn't change. It's a step in the right direction, though. So, exposure doesn't change anyone, but it has a way of giving sudden impetus to practice self-control. It is amazing how when an angry person, when they're going off on somebody, how they can get self-control when somebody calls and wants to talk to them on the phone. If it's just the right person at the right time, it is amazing how we have self-control. That's the idea. Civil authorities. So depending on the nature of the abuse, it is right and proper to call the police. Threats of physical harm to self, others, or property are appropriate to report to authorities. So if a person's life is in danger, it's appropriate to call authorities. If a person puts himself in danger, it's appropriate to call authorities. We tend not to think of that. We tend to think of, well, what about and what about? Often we don't think about, okay, if the person follows through with what they threaten to do, do you want to live with that? And that's the risk that you have to take. And not all people would do the same thing. But I'm saying if people are in danger and they feel like they should call the police, I say you should do that. That's appropriate to do. And I'm not saying call the police for everything, but I'm saying when it's in danger, like when your life is in danger, your life, your children's life, or your husband wants to do harm to himself, it is appropriate to call authorities. And finally, the last one is separation. Separation is a person in danger should do what they can or what they are capable and able to do to get to safety and get help. Talking about perpetrator and victim care. Again, I talked about this a little bit. Just to define terms, is a perpetrator is a person that does the abuse. A victim is a person that is on the receiving end of abuse. And I explained that why. Like a perpetrator doesn't become subhuman or less than human, they remain a human. But they have violated. A victim remains a person, a human being. Not just somebody to be pitied, yes, to care for them, to minister to them, but they're still a human being. Fact is, both need help. The victim needs help, the perpetrator needs help. Each needs a different kind of help. The perpetrator needs help seeing the harm being done to another human being. The victim needs help untangling and dealing with the harm done to them by another human being. It's hard for us to comprehend that a person that committed themselves to loving you is harming you, trying to destroy you. That's kind of hard to wrap our minds around. But it happens. Don't kid yourself. It's this idea, truth and love, justice and mercy, they have to be worked on together. It's not just one or the other, it's holding both and holding them firmly. Speaking the truth in love to a perpetrator is helping this person face reality. Many abusers are ignorant, blind, or deceived to what they are doing or the effects of their words and actions. Some know what they are doing and act deliberately. Speaking truth in love means helping them clear their lenses or providing them with a new set of lenses to see clearly what they do and the effects of it. Speaking the truth in love to a victim is helping this person face reality. Many victims are in a state of confusion trying to make sense of what is happening to them and why. Quite common, is they would minimize the abuse, they would blame themselves, they would rationalize, they would give reasons why this person does it to them. And they need cleared lenses. Initial help, prioritize safety, especially if there is danger of physical harm. Since the victim is taking great risk in uncovering or exposing abuse, get their input and consent before deciding on a course of action. Get their consent. You can help them with resources, financial support, housing, access to medical treatment, transportation, means of communication, meals, safe people, child care if necessary, counseling and or other resources. Initial help, people need lots of help. Time. Allow time and space to tell their story. Victims need time to adjust to a world where it's relatively safe to verbalize thoughts, feelings, desires, and objections without being corrected or challenged. A person that's used to living with their lane, mind, antenna in the own position, it takes time and many assurances that it's safe to be real. I would say it's important to seek help from someone that is qualified. Many people are not equipped, not even in the ballpark of the kinds of help many victims need. And on the other side, many help abusers need. A perpetrator, initial help. Be willing to find another place to live if your spouse prefers this. I think another thing with perpetrators, they need help if they're in danger to themselves or to others. The first, I forget how many days or hours, a perpetrator is in danger in two ways. To other people, they will do harm to other people, or self-harm. You have to keep that in mind. For a perpetrator, stop all measures of trying to control or manipulate your spouse, and especially if they're away from you. For perpetrators, it drives them crazy to be out of control. It kind of just oozes out of them to be in control. Stop trying to locate your spouse or trying to communicate with him or her. Stop slandering your spouse to others. If you are the breadwinner, support your wife financially. Face reality by practicing to tell the whole story Tell the whole story, not pieces of it. Help them to listen to themselves talk. Many perpetrators do not listen to themselves talk. Help them listen to what they emphasize and what they minimize or what they leave out of their story. Help them understand what they're like in public and what they're like in private. Often there's a big gap between the two. They're two very different people. Help them connect those things. They need help with those things initially. Ongoing help. For a victim, they need help in learning a new normal. Normal is like, you think of a spouse dying, okay? The person that's left behind has to learn a new normal. Well, this is similar, just in a different way. It's like finally their world is turned from upside down to right side up, and it's a new normal, and they do not know how to function in that new normal. You need to help them with that in a long term. Again, seek help from someone that's qualified to help, someone that has experience with what this person is talking about. They have to deal with ongoing effects of abuse, things like trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, panic attacks, depression. Those are just some of them. They need help. Often they need help with those things. They need help with identity issues. Who am I? And things like that are not learned over a week or two. They're learned over months. Help them reconnect with church. Sometimes they want to stay away from church. Give them space, help them to navigate that. Reconciliation, I would say, with caution, counsel, and oversight. I'll say more about that in the next topic. Ongoing help for a perpetrator. Seek help from someone or a program that has experience in dealing with abusers. Fresh Start is a good example. Often, abusers need something like 8 to 12 months to actually get a hold of what they're doing. Don't think a week. A week, you can hardly get them to face reality. Secondly, ongoing way, cooperate with civil authorities if they're involved. Be part of a church community that will hold you accountable. That's in an ongoing way for a perpetrator. Learn to. Here's a few things for a perpetrator to learn. You help them with that. Learn to identify, that is, name specific ways, big and small, that you've abused your spouse. A perpetrator that cannot identify or name his sins cannot appropriately repent or change. That's the first step, is being able to identify it. Besides that, name the hard sins that motivated your behavior. That gets behind the actual action, what you did. And then provide a biblical reason why that is evil or sinful. Like it's taken the Bible and distorted it, misused it. Accept full responsibility for your actions. No one caused you to do that. You yourself are the cause, not somebody else. Learn to take responsibility. Embrace the consequences for your actions. Okay, the list that I'm giving I'm saying this is a year's worth of embracing. Few abusers change. I hope that's not shocking. Is it worthless? Is it pointless? No. You never know what God will use. You be faithful and you trust the Lord to do what He wants to do through you. The last one is for an abuser in an ongoing way. Demonstrate genuine change in living. Talk is inadequate. You have to live it out over the long haul. What you say doesn't count. It is, on terms of value, talk is cheap. What has value is how you live. In conclusion, addressing abuse as a counselor often begins with many pieces that need assembling. When standards for interpersonal relationships are violated on a regular basis, both perpetrator and victim develop ways of coping that have common symptoms. Identifying symptoms and addressing their causes biblically are significant parts of victim and perpetrator care. So, here's where you usually start. Lots of pieces. It's a challenge to put it together, and to put it together in a redemptive manner. And it's hard work, and it's long work, and there's not too many who want to do the hard work.